So I'm going to start with the first question, and it's going to be directed to Marc. Many of us are familiar with the picture that's right next to you of Martin Luther King marching with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in the Second Selma March in 1965. So after the beating, everybody went back and marched to Montgomery. It is easy to think of blacks and Jews as having a special solidarity. And in your book, you describe this as, Cheryl actually describes this as an idealized high mark. So what would you say is a more historically accurate way of interpreting the context of this picture and what this says about black-Jewish relations? And then after Marc, if anybody else wants to weigh in.
This was supposed to be the cover of my first book, and then the editors laughed at me and said, everyone wants that as the cover of their first book. It's not going to be the cover of your first book. And that turned out to be a gift because I appreciate the question, honored to be here, and with my colleagues as well. There's a lot of truth here, and there's a lot of mythology at the same time, and the challenge is to hold it both. The truth is that Rabbi Heschel was there, as you can see in the photograph, and risked his power and his privilege in order to give support to the movement. The flip side of it is most white Jews weren't there, and they were northern suburbs, and there's lots of stories that went there. And Rabbi Heschel was all but excommunicated from his own seminary by his rabbinic colleagues who did not think that fighting for racial justice nor fighting against Vietnam, the other thing that he did, was a Jewish thing to do. So this image has sort of morphed from a complex image of the day to an idealized notion of what every white Jew kind of thinks it is now. And just to sort of put the spoiler out at the beginning, 3 top reasons why white Jews joined the civil rights struggle in the 50s and 60s. History, sociology, and religion are the 3. History, blacks and Jews share a common history, so that would bring the 2 groups together. Sociology, blacks and Jews understand what it is to be marginalized in society, and that would bring them together. And then the 3rd is Judaism. Religion has a mandate for social justice, and that should inspire Jews to do it. And if we just take a little bit of digging, we discover that the American Jewish experience and the African American historical experience could not be more different. And if you're locating what's happening in the United States, the story for white Jews is one of rapid social mobility, and in the African American experience, it's slavery and its legacy. Sociologically speaking, and here I just want to honor Emory University professor, who is currently on leave now, Eric Goldstein, The Price of Whiteness, who pointed out in his really important book that white Jews didn't join the movement until after World War II, when they had become white. So if it was going to be shared marginality, it should have happened 40, 50 years earlier for the Eastern European migration. And perhaps painfully most, and I know I have a rabbi to my right, but if Judaism argues for social justice, and we're going to take sort of a halachic Jewish law approach to Jewish, which I know is complicated, Orthodox Jews should have been in the lead. And in fact, it was inverted. The least ritualistic day by day were the most involved, the Reform movement, and actually, are we being recorded?
Yes.
Okay, it's fine. I have tenure because it turned out to be Jewish socialists and communists were actually the ones who were here marching, and while they were disavowing their Judaism.
They're religious Judaism.
Religious Judaism.
Not their Judaism.
I'm getting in trouble more than that. Yeah.
Cheryl, did you want to add? Yeah, please
I
do.
just want to jump in first of all to say that is the cover of my book. But it has a tear down the middle to make exactly the same point. I'm happy to comment now or wait.
Please do.
Marc is absolutely right. We agree on everything, including this. But I do want to sort of underscore some of the differences that you pointed out. But first of all, if it was Jewish theology, not only should the Orthodox have been there, but Jews should have been there in the abolitionist movement, but they weren't. Early Jewish settlers were just as eager as other white ethnic groups, and I'm talking here about European Jews. They're obviously Jews of color, and it's a very complicated story, but here we're talking about white Jews. They are, as Eric and others have pointed out, all white groups were eager to join the white majority, and so Jews, like other white ethnics acted like the rest of their colleagues. So Southern Jews had segregated stores if they owned them, or restaurants or whatever, and even in the North, they were not active in any way. And that really does change, I would say, before World War II because of politics. And that is when Eastern European Jews came, they came much more politically progressive and leftist, communist, labor unionist. And so those are the folks that got involved very early on. These are the early white Jewish engaged people in the NAACP, in the Urban League, those sorts of things. But absolutely, but by and large, this liberal Jewish community doesn't get involved until World War II, and I know that we're going to talk about that. So I just wanted to say, yes.
And one very small thing is that involvement in civil rights by white Jews or white presenting Jews allows Jews to be involved on behalf of others and doesn't demand of them to look at racism within their own community or their own lack of awareness of the diversity that exists within the Jewish community. And so there is, it's very complex and very nuanced, and if we don't go into it the way you were talking about, I think we miss a lot of that.
So, Cheryl, we've seen examples of moments in American history when blacks and Jews have had opportunities to coalesce, and some of these are kind of symbolic touch points founded, based in reality. I'm thinking last night we had the privilege of hearing Andrew Young on our campus, and he was talking about his upbringing in New Orleans and solidarity with the Jewish community. The Karnofsky family of New Orleans that bought Louis Armstrong his first cornet horn is already the stuff of legend. Can you outline some key moments when blacks and Jews did come together, and can you describe in more depth the forces that drove them apart at key moments?
You have plenty of time?
4 minutes.
No problem. Yeah, it's very complicated, and in part it's because, exactly as you're saying, there is no monolithic Jewish community any more than there's a monolithic African American community, of course, but there are these leftist Jews, right, who come over, and secular Jews and Reform Jews who are getting involved in one kind of activity. And then there are these other Jews who, for example, are opening stores in black neighborhoods or whatever. And so when Jews get involved in civil rights efforts, when they have self-interest, every group operates on self-interest. This is nothing new. But what's new to me for any kind of black Jewish collaboration is that for a long moment, many white Jews and African Americans saw their self-interest as aligning on issues that were broader than both of them. It's what I call spacious self-interest. And so you have Jews, for example, and I agree with you about the, sort of ignoring the issue about Jews of color, etc. But also, Jews recognize that Nazism in Europe, the pogroms in Europe, are remarkably similar to things like lynching here. And so the civil rights movement speaks to them because, essentially, if you go there first, we go there next, right? It's the classic formation. And so, again, it's in Jewish self-interest to act on behalf of civil rights, but it's also larger than they are. They act on desegregating schools, even though, of course, Jews are not segregated from elementary schools or whatever. So there are moments where the Jewish community, by and large, embraces these sorts of projects. What's ironic is that you also have these moments, these places where Jews are on the other side too. So, for example, there's a protest in Baltimore about a department store doesn't allow black women to use the changing room, and the owner of the store is Jewish, and the protesters are black and Jewish. So the controversy is sort of right there. So you always have these moments of opportunity where they do see themselves as sharing an agenda. And at the same time, you always have these class and usually race differences that are breaking them apart. That's a really general answer to your question, but apparently not for me.
Does anybody else want to add anything to that before we move on? Well, the next question is for Terrance. So in any relationship, each party, each group, each partner has agency. So what have you found in your research that prompted Black communities to sometimes stand in solidarity with, but also in opposition to their Jewish neighbors?
No, I mean, it's a really good question. And, I think what's interesting, I want to make sure we kind of emphasize that, we argue in our book that this relationship is really strategic and that it's primarily among elite men. And they're trying to negotiate, how do they actually negotiate their power in public life? And so I think, they coalesce around issues of economics, right? You have Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington coming together to equally contribute to, these Rosenwald schools that are educating Blacks in the South, where they could not get public education. And they're also sort of converging around even ideas around homeland, right? You see Stokely Carmichael, folk like Ethel Minor, talking about homelands, and a number of the sort of left SNCC members are reading Zionist figures. And so there's interesting kind of overlaps in terms of thinking about homeland, thinking about this idea of how do we use our capital to the best of our ability. But then with 67 and mid-60s, we see a huge kind of clash. And in many respects, when you look through some of the archives of the SNCC members, people are beginning to say a couple of things. On the one hand, they're saying, look, we're very appreciative of whites joining us in the movement, and especially appreciative of our white Jewish brothers and sisters. And yet we feel as if our hands are tied because we really can't grow because we don't have complete ownership or, let's say, authority over the organization because a number of whites and white Jews had leadership positions. And so there's a whole debate in terms of what do we do with white members, because we want to have the coalition. And yet when we look at our white Jewish brothers and sisters, as an outsider, it appears as if they've done a really good job of making sure they build solid organizations in which they are controlling them. And those organizations are really helping to fuel their families and also to fuel their growth in society. So that's one issue. There's also an issue that at the beginning emerges over then issues around rights and voting rights. Clearly, both groups coalesced around voting rights. They work with NAACP, right, to help fight for political rights, also to end segregation. Brown versus Board of Education is clearly a major case for NAACP, where you see kind of united efforts. And then also, it's interesting, a guy named Jack Greenberg, right, is kind of the heir apparent to Thurgood Marshall in terms of the head of the Legal Defense Fund. And it was kind of tricky because there are several Black women one in particular, who was in line for the position and didn't get it. And so it's interesting kind of, again, relationship. But Stokely begins to write in his journals, look, we're discovering that our white Jewish brothers and sisters they're assimilating, they're moving to the suburbs, they're fleeing urban areas, and they appear to be very successful, right, or becoming successful. And there's a huge tension. And then with 67, with the war in Israel, it's like, wait a minute. Carmichael was saying, look, I believe in Zionism, but not Zionism that looks like colonialism. And so there's a huge debate in terms of how they are reading, right, the war, but also debate over what are the limits of political rights. Carmichael was saying, and others, look, we see how rights have benefited white Jews. We don't seem to have benefited. Then there's a whole debate over what do we do with capitalism, right? Do we actually try to abolish it? Do we think about ourselves as folk who are aligned with human rights issues or in terms of transnational issues? And that seems to create some kind of acrimony within SNCC among the white members, and that also creates an issue. So I think those three issues around capitalism, around rights, right, and then also around this idea, what is it, homeland? And then lastly, I would say the issues around affirmative action, I mean, pretty much, again, I think Israel and affirmative action kind of sealed the deal in terms of the potential for having a real strategic relationship, unfortunately.
So many in the audience may be familiar with work by scholars such as David Roediger, Matthew Jacobson, Mary Waters, Eric Goldstein, and others who look at how white ethnics, including Jewish immigrants, assimilated into the United States, in part because of phenotype, but also because they actively adopted the mores of white society. So the first time I was introduced to this was watching The Jazz Singer and watching Al Jolson become white by donning blackface. So what are some constructive ways to think about the acculturation of Eastern European Jews, the modal Jewish person I'm thinking of, Ashkenazi Jews, into the framework of whiteness? And so this question is for anyone. But if somebody wants to begin, I know who to point to.
So thank you. We got the questions very briefly ahead of time, and I just read the word constructive and whiteness next to each other, and I said, that's going to be a challenge. Yesterday in my modern Jewish history class at San Francisco State, we read primary source documents. They read a letter between two white Jewish men in the South in the 17th century. Both were slave owners, and half of the letter they wrote back and forth was full of Jewish stuff, and the other half had the N-word everywhere. And it was stunning and shocking and hard and difficult for us to sort of process, and I really think that we were kind of trying to get at this question. And I asked the class, I said, in one word, what's happening in the letter, right? And someone said assimilation, and then someone else said whiteness, right? Which I thought, was far more pointed. When one becomes white and enjoys the privilege, one can move in that direction, and we see that. Another more constructive approach is to share, to open, and to bring in something that's happening in the contemporary period, at least that I'm seeing a lot in my public work, are white Jews denying their whiteness, which is another entirely new spin on how to deal with that. And I ultimately come to the anthropological notion of liminality, that is that white Jews are both part of a disproportionately powerful group and also part of a disproportionately persecuted group. And in the United States, to be both of those simultaneously is hard to hold. And I also like to hope and think that that is the place where this group can bring social change, because they can move between groups, even if neither group accepts completely and neither group rejects completely.
Yeah, if I can add to that just briefly, I totally agree, of course. But I just wanted to, I have the same encounters when I talk to Jewish groups. We're not white, and they point to the fact that the white Christian nationalists, right, all hate Jews, and they're absolutely correct in that, right? So to those people, Jews are not white, they are a separate race. But what they don't seem to grasp well enough, in my opinion, is the extent to which Jewish privilege has been based on whiteness. So they got their loans for their businesses, they got because they were phenotypically white. But if white people have tried to push you into gas ovens, it's really hard to acknowledge that you're white. Okay, I understand that. The problem now, though, at least that I see, is that if Jews don't acknowledge the ways in which whiteness has privileged them, then they can't be part of dismantling it in order to solve the problem for other people. So it is sort of alluding to what you were saying before, I think, a dodge.
Well, it's a dodge, but I think also the moment, from a rabbinic point of view, I would say like a moral point of view, when you have a system of racism that is so embedded in everything that we do in this country, everything, it makes it's an immoral system. It is based on the premise that some people are not people. Mm-hmm. And once you go into that direction, you do not there is no way to engage in that system morally. Right. There is no way for people to be, I do training. People say, what's the right thing to do? I'm like, if you want the right thing to do, then you have to understand that you're not going to win this game. This is a system that is setting us up to fail. And so Jews who have, on some level, as white presenting Jews, have tried to figure out how to survive or navigate the system, mm-hmm. They've been pushed into what I would say are tremendously immoral choices, and they've thought that they were doing good, but often some of the even their best choices were terrible.
Anybody else want to add anything? Terrance, Candice?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I thought it was interesting, in terms of when Cheryl was talking, this idea that when we think about Charlottesville in 2016, we're chanting blacks and Jews will not replace us. So I thought it was interesting in terms of there's this lingering image of somehow, yes, to the white Christians, the Jews aren't white, and yet there's something about the way they imagine blacks and Jews as not only part of the problem, but part of the problem that needs to be disciplined in a very violent way. And I often wonder that when we talk about, say, white Jewish assimilation, we never all talk about that sort of the doubleness or that angst in terms of what does it mean to live in a system where you might pass, and yet there's this real threat. And I say real threat, meaning this sort of like knowing that in some ways you are living like not only on the edge, but a kind of doubleness that in some ways you either have to embrace or suppress or walk a very fine line on that rope. And so that's why I wanted to just kind of just bring that to forward. I think it's just really interesting in terms of how white nationalists collapsed us together, and yet what are the implications for that for white passing Jews?
So I am thinking about those groups, Bundists, socialists, communists who were very active in the interwar period in the 20s and 30s, and the ways that they engaged in race discourse, including in the realm that I study, which is children's literature. I mean, I'm thinking of a Yiddish children's story from 1940 that was published under Bundist auspices, that very much presented whiteness as a choice and as a road that the reader should not take, right? That it would be better to stand in solidarity and to form a coalition with African Americans, with Negroes as they were being called at the time, right? I'm thinking about Bernie Sanders on NPR this week talking about his new book, It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, where he sees the racial critique that's necessary, and he routes it through an economic critique. So how much when we talk about race should we be thinking about that through class differences? What is the best sort of order of operations for our thinking about race and class? And maybe Cheryl, you want to start with that?
Sure. I think the reason that's such a hard question to answer is that they are so intertwined in this country. I mean, the reason that the Bundists are saying we need to make common cause is that their whole argument is class, right? If you're dividing the working class by separating them by race, then the winners are the owners, right? And so we need to make common cause. By the time you get to the anti-communism thing, then you can't say that anymore, right? And so that sort of takes a back step. What's hard, though, about saying that it's only class is that not every white Jew is liberal on this question, but in fact, given their class position, white Jews vote for these sort of more working class agendas far more than they should if you compare them to other whites. And so I think class is relevant, absolutely, but it's also the recognition that in the United States, at least, race pretty much trumps class. I apologize for that word. And because the Jews will not replace us thing puts Jews on the outside on those dialogues, we Jews, can't afford to act our class privilege, essentially, and we have to push these other things. So it's a really important question, but it's also very intertwined, as it is, of course, in the black community, where wealthier black people are living with poorer black people because of discrimination based on race. So it's a big mess.
Anyone else?
Also, similarly, this is a part of what my second book is about, right? That black bourgeois people are sort of invisible in a way because blackness and poverty are so naturalized. And so, in a kind of, reversal of what Cheryl's talking about. I think there's, it's really important to not assume that all black people are impoverished and that therefore sort of any tension or issue there is about a class challenge and not actually about race, because, whatever income level black people might occupy, we are still subject to racial violence, racial discrimination. And so, the class argument rarely flies, right? It rarely explains for us everything that's happening.
So, starting this question with Candice and then with Ruth, we've alluded to the fact that neither the black nor the Jewish community is a monolith, and that there are people who identify as both black and Jewish. Both of you work with and study and think about this intersection. So how do we factor this reality into a conversation about conflict and solidarity? Could we start with you, Candice?
Sure. I mean, this is a really interesting question for me. I mean, where I've studied this is in, the work of someone like Rebecca Walker, or Danzy Senna's novel Caucasia is another interesting sort of example of that. And honestly, where it plays out is in racial mixing, given that most of the time, not all the time, obviously there are other examples, but when we're talking about those who are both Black and Jewish, it's because they have a Black parent and a Jewish parent. And in that case, we're talking about mixed race subjects as well. So, then there's the question of how does mixed race identity sort of shape one's relationship to either group, right? And how are those individuals received, or how do they position themselves in relation to either group? And I think that's something that, may or may not make the question of solidarity easier, right? Because when we're talking from a Black perspective and we're talking about mixed race people, one of the things that becomes a question is like, how does that phenotypically present, right? There are mixed race folks of many different hues. If we're talking about a white passing or largely white presenting person, that's going to be a very different kind of experience than someone who has kinkier hair texture, darker skin, et cetera. And sometimes that does mean, we have studies that demonstrate this, that the reception for those that visibly signal proximity to whiteness, right, via skin tone, they're received differently in white spaces, right? Are seen as smarter, et cetera. And so, and that also may mean that Tressie McMillan Cotton was just talking about this in relation to VP Kamala Harris, that this affects how one experiences the brunt of anti-Black racism as well. So all of that is to say, those questions of solidarity, when we're also talking about mixed race, Black and Jewish subjects, that's a question that is also about liminality, as Marc pointed out, and being sort of between two groups as well.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, and I think that it's liminality, and it's also the ability to literally have to code switch between different communities. There are various studies that show either between 10 and up to 20%, depending on how you're counting, Jews in the United States are people of color or living in households with people of color. We don't have a methodology or good numbers, but it's a much larger number than people expect. But when we look at who is representing the Jewish community, who are the rabbis, who are the professors, who are the community leaders, we're not seeing that intersection. And among Jews of color, there are people who are, as you said, Candice, with parents, one who is a white presenting Jew and one who is a Black, but maybe not of the same, but maybe Jewish, but maybe not. But there are also people who are converts, people who are adopted, and people who are who have been Jewish for generations. So I think that's one of the other things that's very hard, is that there are a lot of assumptions about who Jews of color are and who Black Jews are. And it makes it very hard for them, because in spaces where the presumption is Jewish looks like my face, when a Black Jew shows up, people will often be either racist or anti-Semitic, depending on the context, without any awareness that they are causing personal and direct offense, even though we know that nobody should be any of those things in any spaces, but we also know that people are people. And so it is really interesting. When I work with people, the amount of pain and isolation that people feel is extreme. At the same time, people who are living at that intersection, a few weeks ago, Michael Twitty was here, and if you don't know him, you should know him. He's a wonderful culinary historian and author, award-winning, and he talked about how the different parts of his identity, being queer, being Jewish, and being Black, the brokennesses of the different pieces get fixed by the strengths of the others, right? So that's one of the things that I think really we can learn from people at intersections. I know personally that I have learned a great deal from working in a multiracial Jewish community and from working with people of color about resilience. That is not a topic Jews tend to talk about. About joy, again, not a topic Jews tend to talk about. But when you look at those intersections of those communities, new ideas come up that can help us fix each other, and we can learn from our survival strengths as opposed to just comparing our oppressions. And finally, I would just say that if you're interested in looking at the power of those intersections in fighting oppression, I would recommend 2 social media accounts. One is Tova the Poet, who is Tova Ricardo out of the Bay Area, and the other is Shakina Larks, who is also out of the Bay Area, 2 young women who are doing exceptional work talking about the complexities of their identities as individual Black Jewish women, but also talking to their communities, multiple communities, about what it means to not be quiet in the face of either anti-Semitism or racism wherever they find it.
Can you just jump in on the other side, which is to say, what are we losing by acting like all Jews are white? And first of all, for example, in my book, I talk a lot about paternalistic moves in the Jewish community. Oh, we will help you, whatever. That's because Jews don't realize that there are people who are vulnerable in their own communities. They just sort of think everybody who's Jewish is white and middle class and everything like that. And so they lose the perspective and the ability to be effective partners. And the second way, I think, and again, as you said, all of the leadership in the Jewish community is white, and so we all think everybody's white. They speak for the community, and the community is white, and we miss a whole segment as a result. And I think the other consequence is that we, and again, here I speak for white Jews, completely ignore the impact on our co-religionists who are of color. So there's the obvious stuff, right? Anybody who walks into a synagogue who's Black, you say, oh, what are you doing here? That's very hurtful, and so, okay, we can educate that to a certain extent. But, for example, there are several synagogues that contacted me and said, we don't know what to do with Black Lives Matter because we think the police are really wonderful. They help protect our synagogue when these threats happen, and we appreciate that. But then it turns out that those people who are guarding the synagogues stop every Black Jewish person and say, what are you doing here? So they are, besides the fact that most of the people who are threatening are white, but we'll just leave that aside, right? So that the Jewish community, the white Jewish community, doesn't realize the extent to which they are alienating their own community by that kind of blindness to the importance of race.
And I would push it further that sometimes, we marched with Black Lives Matter becomes an excuse for not looking at the racism that is the internalized and of our community, and denying the pernicious impact it has on the individuals who are then alienated. So when you don't see people in synagogue, is it because they literally couldn't get in the door, or they got in the door and they've been insulted so many times that they've just stopped coming? And so I think that I think all of our communities miss out on the chance to talk about, Candice, you talked about the middle class Black community, right? Part of what we're doing there is talking about complexity and texture. And when we don't do that, then we reduce everybody to stereotypes, which is always a problem.
So I want to talk about some things that have happened in the last 6 months that many of you may be familiar with. So we, of course, have witnessed an increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the last 6 months, even in the past week. And there have been some really high-profile crimes and comments that have been anti-Semitic that have been committed by people of color. So I want to focus on the ones involving African Americans for a moment. I'm sure you've all heard about Ye's various comments, so formerly known as Kanye West. But perhaps we could dismiss those because we are all aware of his struggles with public health and are also aware and concerned that he's not being treated at the moment for those. And maybe you could explain Kyrie Irving away because we also know he thinks the world is flat, so like there are lots of problems there. I can't explain Dave Chappelle's comments on Saturday Night Live as easily. So should we be looking for a common thread between those allegations of anti-Semitism? Do they reflect the Black community as a whole, or is it just these guys say really harmful and hurtful things and are reflective of themselves? I will open that to anyone.
Can I just answer first by pushing back a little bit?
Okay.
Which is to say, yes, there have been some Black people who have been anti-Semitic, but there have been a whole lot more white people who have been anti-Semitic, and they don't make the media in quite the same way. And I'm not criticizing you, I'm criticizing the media here. So, I was just reading about the play about Leo Frank, and that they had demonstrations outside by neo-Nazis. They're all white, right? But we're not reading about those. And so I'm a little uneasy, and again, not at your question, but at the tendency that we have to flag Black people who are doing bad stuff and say, oh, well, you see, they're anti-Semitic or whatever. And the other thing I, again, want to challenge is I don't think, certainly, Kyrie himself is not pushing anything that is the remotest bit new. So my question is really, why is it surfacing now? Right? Those Black Israelites have been standing on street corners for a long time. But now, they're in the mainstream. And I would say, and again, this is not to derail your question, but to say, I think this is something about where we are as a society now, right? That conspiracy theories have been mainstreamed, that racism and hatred have been mainstreamed, and so it's much easier for these lunatics to say these things, and again, easier for the media to pick up on people of color who say them, then it's a real increase in Black anti-Semitism or whatever. And again, I'm not accusing you of saying that, but that's how it's been playing out, at least in the media, in my mind.
I think that's a really good point, Cheryl. And, often, we'll get a call, like my colleague and I get a call when something, oh, there's a Black anti-Semitic comment. Can you make a comment about it? And like you, I'm frustrated as well. But I also think sort of the uber attention, right, to so-called Black anti-Semitism has everything to do with, I think, again, this unusual relationship in terms of the American imagination about Blacks and Jews. We don't know of any other two groups that have been closely aligned and also closely, right, imagined within the broader public in ways in which Blacks and Jews are. And I think what's interesting about, particularly with the Kyrie Irving piece, right, is that, my colleague and I wrote about this a few months ago, but it was like, when I was at Morehouse, part of the ritual is that, okay, you have to question your identity. And we were all looking for an identity that didn't start with slavery. And in many respects, I argued that it was about, how do you have a different origin story? I mean, how do you have an origin story that's actually in a place where people were productive, where there was beauty, where there was tragedy, but also joy? And I think with Irving, what's so interesting is that, because of his wealth and because of who he is, he gets the spotlight. But in so many cases, right, this is sort of the ritual that so many African American, particularly African American men, right, kind of pursue at the collegiate level. But I think the reason why it gets so much attention is that when you see people like, whether it's Irving or whether it's LeBron James, they are in conversations with very high profile people who are disproportionately white and Jewish men. And I do think that creates for an interesting kind of antagonism, right? Because when LeBron James retweeted, oh, I want that Jewish money, people are like, oh, it's anti-Semitic. And in the abstract, it is. But what he was actually saying, he was like, look, I actually think this is an admirable community. I love the way how they use their resources to support each other. That's why I have these schools. That's why I have the school in Akron. That's why I support certain causes. And I too want to, quote unquote, flex my power in that same way. Again, very patriarchal, very sort of, very kind of questionable masculinist kind of theory around that. But I do think that's what's part of the attraction, is that these people are high profile. They're with a very sort of small segment of the population. And so when something happens, then it gets all, blown out. And also it sells, right? People are really excited about, oh, these two people hate each other and they both have been marginalized. Wow, why can't they get along? People are excited about it.
if I could also just add about Dave Chappelle, I mean, Dave Chappelle, I think in his, I don't know if it's saying too much to call them his elder years as a comedian. I mean, I think he's positioning himself as a provocateur, right? I mean, I think that this is so very differently than Ye and the, whatever's happening there with his mental health, and Kyrie Irving. I don't think, I think that they're sort of doing different, these things are doing different things. I think Dave Chappelle is very deliberately trying to push the envelope, right? Trying to go to the line of like, what can I say? And that is about, how he has, I mean, we can see that also in the way that he has, used his platform in relation to trans folks. I think that, it, for me, makes it difficult to remain a fan, in part because it's just such a kind of curmudgeonly position. So that, separate from the offense, right, is also that this is what his comedy has become. And so I think that that's what he thinks he is doing, right, is provoking with these, things that he knows are going to cause outrage. But, for me, it's not particularly funny, right? I mean, but he, I think, thinks that that's the work, right? And so, I think that is a kind of, creative choice on Dave Chappelle's part that I don't think we can say applies to these other figures.
Marc.
Yeah. For me, this is about constructed narratives and conflicting narratives. Now, I'll speak as an historian, and that is that all of us, when we talk about personal history, family history, ethnic, however you want to define our history, it's a narrative. It's a story. It's got a beginning, middle, and moving to an end, and it's constructed. We create it. And I'm in American Jewish history, so I deal a lot with what narratives white Jews have constructed about social justice. That happens to be my thing. And it's a very finely tuned, constructed narrative that sometimes has actual facts in it and a lot of analysis that may or may not line up. And in African American communities, there are also constructed narratives. And when an event happens in the news, it's going to land on a pre-existing constructed narrative. And then the response is actually going to be that narrative. And what happens in these moments are the two constructed narratives conflict with one another. And really what we're seeing, I was asked to comment when Whoopi Goldberg made her comment, right? And so first of all, I'm not concerned about those comments. I'm not even concerned about Dave Chappelle. And when Whoopi Goldberg made her comments, it's like, black woman in America, what's your constructed narrative? That's it, right? And when she said that, she got right in the way of a lot of white Jewish constructed narratives as well, and sort of how that was going back and forth. So, for example, I'm on this, I call it the Anti-Semitism Committee. It's actually the Anti-Semitism Committee at San Francisco State. And we met days after the Dave Chappelle thing. And the Jewish people on the committee were very upset, and the administration wanted to address this. And I'm like, yesterday the day before my American Jewish history class, we're reading Neil Gabler's An Empire of Their Own, How Jews Invented Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And I said, Chappelle said, there's a lot of Jews in Hollywood. A lot of Jews in Hollywood. That was his line. And I said, is that anti-Semitism or last week's reading in my class? Right. Which is about the two different narratives coming into conflict.
Again, the reason Jews went to Hollywood was they couldn't create narratives in other spaces. Right. And that goes back to the fact that there is a system of oppression that says certain stories get told and certain stories don't get told. Again, if the whole system is amoral, there aren't easy choices people can make without coming into conflict, because the goal, as you've said, is to put us in conflict with each other as opposed to having us work together, because then it would be unstoppable, right? Then we could really potentially dismantle these systems.
And can I just add one thing? I wonder, Candice might be able to help me here, but there's also, in terms of when we think about Black comedy, so much of Black comedy is really about self-critique. Right? When you think about Jordan Peele and his show, it was like, I mean, they would lambaste all these football players in terms of their names, right? Really make fun of the idea that Blacks are overpopulated in, say, NBA and football. And there's a way in which whether it's in Black preaching, right? You think of the Million Man March, it was about this idea of atoning, like literally a million men gathered to atone for their sins and to become quote unquote better men and better fathers. There's something about that kind of discourse that African Americans are in some ways, I would argue, very much anticipate, but also they kind of engage. And I'm not sure the broader public understands the ways in which signifying happens in these sort of comedic moments. Again, not to in any way justify any comments, and yet that self-criticism, right, is then often extended into this quote unquote the white category, or as Dave Chappelle said, the Jew or the Jews. And I'm wondering if we could actually also have a more nuanced view of how Black folk use discourse and signification, both in these comedic spaces, but also in Black preaching and also in writing.
I just want to, I'm so glad you raised that, because I wanted to say this and then I got nervous, so now I'm going to say it. I was not actually offended very much by Dave Chappelle, because the line about, you get 7 Italians together and it's the mafia. You get 7 Black people together and it's a gang. You get 7 Jews together and it's a coincidence. I thought that was hilarious because it's not about anti-Semitism, it's about the sensitivity of Jews. Like, no, you can't talk about Jews without being anti-Semitic. And so I took it exactly the way you were saying. Terrance, he's making fun of lots of things, but it's like when Jews were upset about Minister Farrakhan. Minister Farrakhan is absolutely an anti-Semite, but he's also anti-Catholic. He's also sexist. But the response that he got was from the Jewish community. And so that's how he's going to play it, and that's how the media is going to play it. So again, many of you will disagree about David Chappelle, that's fine, but my point is that I think that there's also something to be said for the sensitivity of the Jewish community. Again, I understand why it exists, but also that Jews sort of play into the narrative of the crisis by seeing it that way.
Well, that's again that each community has its different kinds of traumas. Right? And the Jewish sensitivity is not random. And it's not just, and like to dismiss it, again, I think doesn't acknowledge the deep, long-seated history of anti-Semitism in the world and that implication for our bodies and our minds.
Right.
That having been said, does not mean that sometimes we couldn't learn a little bit of resilience and some other kinds of muscles that might make us be able to be a little more flexible and have some perspective.
And I'll add, and the other thing is both and, which is to say that the Jewish narrative around that trauma can exist along with an understanding that other American groups will construct their own narratives, honestly reflecting where they're at, and can we be in a place where we can hold both?
Yeah.
So the inverse of the idea of Black anti-Semitism would be Jewish racism, right? Purim is coming, and we can think back a decade to when a New York State Assemblyman went very publicly in blackface to a Purim party. Or we can think about conservative commentator Ben Shapiro now and how he engages in racialized discourse. When we think about these kinds of occurrences in the Jewish community, are these unitary, or is there something larger going on here that the Jewish community needs to be grappling with?
Yes, there is something larger that the Jewish community needs to be grappling with. I think as Jews have assimilated, the majority of Jews in the United States, so let's say 80% are white presenting, we've assimilated into whiteness, and we assimilated ideas of white supremacy. We'd like to think we didn't, but we have. And racist tropes and ideas permeate every part of American Jewish life. There's just unless we acknowledge it, there will be children on the playground we have a holiday coming up where people dress up in costumes. Unfortunately, I can say to you now, there will be white presenting Jewish children in blackface, in sombreros, in all kinds of other things that are highly inappropriate. and people won't even understand. I had somebody tell me that their child was, their black child was denied entrance to a Jewish school because they did not want to have trouble again if the mother was going to raise the issue of not having blackface at that school for so this is very real. Like, this is not pretend. And there is a deep, I would say a deep denial, even when people are thinking about it on, they're doing all the right things in theory, bringing in DEI consultants. The real work of changing it is very slowly, only happening very slowly.
So I want to bring up Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter is, of course, a full-fledged social movement. It's been around for a decade at this point. And they've taken a clear stance in solidarity with Palestinians, as do many people on the left. So what does it look like to be pro-Black, pro-Palestinian, and pro-Jewish?
I'm happy to start because I always piss people off, so I'm just going to say it. I don't think there's any problem with being pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, and pro-Palestinian, those three things. Yes, being pro-Jewish and pro-Black, right. Sorry. Because I think to be Jewish and to be pro-Black or Black Lives Matter is to say that everybody deserves human rights, et cetera, et cetera. Where I think the conflict comes is that some Jews hear any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. So I can say, I am appalled by what the state of Israel is doing. And I can be called a self-hating Jew, but I can't be called an anti-Semite. So I'm safe. But anybody else who says, I have a problem with Israel and the way they're treating Palestinians, some Jewish person's going to come and say, oh, you're an anti-Semite. And so that's where the conflict lies, in my mind. There's no conflict among people who agree that Judaism is good and black people are good and Palestinians deserve rights. It's just that transformation of anti-Israel criticism into anti-Semitism, which again can happen, but usually is not the case. That's where I think the mess comes in. Now you can all yell at me.
I'd like to back up the question, actually, before we get to the Israel-Palestine stuff. Black Lives Matter. The question is, what does that mean, right? And this is where the constructed narratives come in. So when I sort of teach this to white Jewish audiences, I said, let's try this out. Black lives matter. And just sit there in silence with that. About 2.5 seconds before someone gets upset and they point out 200 words in a 40,000 word platform by one organization that is associated with it that referred to Israel as an apartheid state. Right. And I go back and say, okay, so the question is, do Black lives matter? Mm-hmm. The answer is yes or no. Take your pick. Let's go with yes. And if that's the truth, then let's let that sit right there and be that. And let's not intervene any other narratives into that truth. Oh, by the way, there's going to be issues on the left between white Jews on the left around Israel and Palestine. That's also nothing new. So are we, as white Jewish progressives, going to use an age-old conflict, it's going on for decades, to undermine the concept that Black Lives Matter? Or are we going to respect that Black Lives Matter and then also deal as a separate issue with something that's really intractable in a lot of ways? So what I see is the willingness of too many white Jewish audiences to not care about Black Lives Matter because they need to elevate the ancillary issues, and I'm saying let's not be opportunistic to find a way not to be justice-centered.
Anybody else?
So we talked a little bit about resilience practices. Getting more specific, what are the shared or mutually informative experiences of resilience that Jewish and Black identities can offer each other, especially in the American context?
I was actually thinking about this because I think his name is Lawrence Thomas. He's a African-American philosopher who talks a lot about about Jewish and black suffering, right? Different narratives, but similar suffering. And he argues that black people can learn a lot from Jewish tradition because of the way that Jews approach the story. And so I thought back to the joke about what is every single Jewish holiday about, right? They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, right?
That's the formula.
That's the formula, exactly. And so I think to that extent, the ways in which each community celebrates its triumphs over adversity, Juneteenth, all of those are ways that it seems to me we can help each other deal with these deep traumas and figure out how to celebrate resilience, as you said, rather than simply focus on the victimization.
I also would add to that, and I mean, I probably can only speak for myself personally, but never forget as an ethos around the Holocaust. I mean, to me, is something that is extremely valuable, and one of the reasons that that's meaningful, and I think could be and hopefully can be meaningful to Black people in the Black communities, is because we are so often encouraged to forget, and to or I mean the more popular language would be get over, right, the things that have been done to us, and I think that is a kind of erasure. I mean, we've already sort of gestured toward folks like Ben Shapiro, right, who are actively denying the existence of sort of structural racism and discrediting critical race theory. I mean, what's happening in Florida is another example, right? In terms of these things that are actually American history, right? When we talk about Black history, and I think that of course there are specific things that we can understand as Black history, but when we're talking about slavery or Jim Crow or mass incarceration, right? And, we're talking about things that are happening in America, not in a vacuum to Black people. So, the idea of erasing that, right, and wanting to forget that seems to be a national pastime almost, trying to forget that history. And I think the idea of never forget is very valuable. I see that as very valuable because of that.
And I think never forget as a way of studying and understanding the value of history, to me is, I mean, if that is not a place where our communities come together and really, if there is no Jew, in my opinion, of any race that should not be out on the barricades fighting to learn American history in all its complexity and all its messiness, as uncomfortable and as hard as it is, because I think that is something that Jews do know, the value of understanding the complexity, and we should all be in this together because it is our collective history. And that resilience, the fact that there is any resilience at all, is something that should inspire all of us to the possibilities. So I think that that's also a place we can come together. I hope. I mean, I would hope. I know it doesn't always happen, but I think it's important.
In terms of racial hierarchies, the movement in the 50s and 60s, I mean, there's always going to be white racial privilege, and at least the way in which the 50s and 60s were seen as often as the white Jews reaching down in a gesture of friendship to lift up the Black community, and that frame itself is automatically lost once that frame is there. How can we achieve a more co-equal frame, even though we know we never will with race as it is? But that said, white nationalists have a target on white Jews and Blacks simultaneously. So if there's an idea of a protest movement where Blacks and whites and Jews and that can all be side by side, with the notion that, unfortunately, with the common enemy, here is a moment where all of us are invested in one another, even across racial lines, because the threat sadly comes to everyone. That would be the ideal. The flip side is the oppression Olympics, which is all too often happens with essentially the white Jewish group wanting to prove that they are more oppressed than others, and I'm like, that's actually the backwards way. So I would want to invert what we had in the 50s and 60s and the Olympics to get at. So that's all there is.
That's a great seg. Oh, go ahead, Terrance.
No, I was gonna one very quickly. What I think is interesting, Marc, is again, my progressive friends might push me on this, but I think a great liberal example of where the relationship is not so asymmetrical is what happened in Georgia over the last, say, 7 years. You look at Stacey Abrams and what she was able to do for both Senators Ossoff and Warnock. Many people have argued that she is the reason why that her organization opened the gateway for Warnock and Ossoff to get elected. And when you think about Ossoff has said, look, I was able to ride the coattails of Warnock because of all of his popularity. And he attributes Warnock to his success. So that's a very different kind of model, right? In terms of white Jews relying on African Americans for political strategy, but also as social capital. The question becomes then, what's the end product? In other words, are they simply going to sort of sit into the liberal platform? How transformative will their politics look like over the next couple of years? But I do think it's pretty extraordinary. And unfortunately, Abrams, at least in the short term, appears to have not as won in terms of she didn't get the election. And yet everyone said, look, she transformed Georgia politics and how we even think about the electorate. And so I'm hoping that this story will get told because, again, Black women during SNCC and the Civil Rights Movement were very crucial. I mean, Ella Baker was sent by Stanley Levinson saying, look, please help out my friends King and Abernathy because they can't run SCLC. So he sent her down as a way to help them out. And so I think it's interesting this moment to see that relationship kind of shift, and also what's happening in DC with Schumer and the Democrat in the House. I just run around the blank on his name. I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, you see this whole Black Jewish thing happening also on the Capitol. So I do think that kind of asymmetry has potential to change given these examples.
This segs into our final question before we open it up to the audience. And so we want everybody to answer. What would you do to promote solidarity and understanding across both groups? I'm going to start with Candice because we want you to frame your thoughts in terms of Afrofuturism.
I was like hoping we would just run out of time for this, this last piece, because I've been pondering this question of like, how do I frame this in the context of Afrofuturism? Although one of the things that comes to mind when I think about kind of the spirit of Afrofuturism, and I'm writing a book that's called Speculative Pessimism, right? So I'm not someone who sees Afrofuturism as a sort of purely optimistic, hopeful kind of space. I think about Alicia Walmsley's installation, There Are Black People in the Future, right? That, this is a billboard that she put up in Pittsburgh in a gentrifying neighborhood. And, has sort of since been taken up by many other artists and creators. But it's interesting so on the one hand, thinking about what a statement like There Are Black People in the Future suggests about, why that statement needs to be made, right? Suggests about questions of erasure and risk and vulnerability in the present moment, right? I think that's, a place where both of our groups might have some common ground, even if we're coming at it from very different positions in this, contemporary moment. But I also, apropos of erasure, I started sort of doing some research about Pittsburgh and about this neighborhood. And of course, if we go back 100 years, right, the neighborhood of East Liberty was a sort of super diverse, heavily immigrant, but also African-American neighborhood or sort of area in Pittsburgh. And, when redlining was happening in the 30s, this was a moment in which not just Negroes, but also Jews, Italians, et cetera, were sort of talked about as infiltrating, this neighborhood and creating the need to redline, right? So, this is the longer history of the neighborhood in which, Walmsley puts up this billboard in a sort of response to gentrification. So it's also interesting to me to think about, some of those old connections that we've already talked about historically, and whether we can access and think about that history as we're sort of in our positions today, and also thinking about where we will these our groups will be in the future, and that we will be in the future. Who will we be? So that's what I've got.
Both and on both sides. Yeah, I mean that's been my thesis like the whole time, which is let's hold complexity and not compete with one another. And I think referencing what both of you have said earlier, that the system works to divide, and when we think we're advocating for ourselves, we're actually destroying both of ourselves, or ourselves if we're Black and Jewish at the same time. So.
Well, I could piggyback on that because I was going to say, to come back to your point originally about the fact that Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, hates us both. That I know I sound elderly now, but remember the old days, like when people cared about each other, you know, and communities, and nobody does that anymore. Like my students are like, well, if it doesn't have to do with me, I don't care. I understand that it's only rhetorical, right, largely, but there was an argument that we're all sort of in this together, and it seems to me that, again, to come back to the sort of sense of spacious self-interest, that to return to that kind of focus of it is in our interest as a community to care about the welfare of other communities. And why? Because we are all in it together. And Jews won't replace us, and Black people won't replace, right? All that kind of stuff. We really are fighting a common enemy. And the more we can make common cause because it is our shared cause, I think, the better off we'll be.
For me, one of the things that I'm constantly bumping up against is the impact of trauma on communities and how it challenges us to be spacious, right? Our own traumas, whatever our communities are, or our own fears stop us from being spacious. When there is a really big cake, we don't worry if we're going to get the piece with the rose. If there's only one rose, though, then we get really worried that we're not going to get that piece of cake. And right now, I think we're seeing that lack of spaciousness, and people getting very anxious. So my encouragement to everyone is, if we can, and this is not about policy, but on that individual level, if we can recognize that our own issues might stop us from being able to be there and listening or hearing what other people's traumas, needs, desires, full humanity are, then if we can catch ourselves before we get into the please justify yourself to me so that I don't feel scared, stop and just say, I'm feeling scared. That is because of generations and other issues. Can I be there in humanity with this other person and allow the complexity? It's not always, I'm not going to, I don't, Marc and I, we know each other, what, 15 years, 16 years? We don't always agree. We agree on a lot, but we don't always agree. There's nobody I agree with all the time. So why is it when it comes to race, I think I'm going to agree with somebody else? Let's assume we won't agree on everything, and let's start to find those places. I think if we can give ourselves some more space, then we can maybe give the other people more space.
Terrance, you have the last word.
I'm both, I could think, excited, but also a bit sort of just cautious as well, because, you know, our students don't live next to each other anymore. They don't really socialize together. And my concern is that we're in a moment where everything is sort of just, is so embellished and everyone's in their kind of their silos. And so I'm not sure how to break that, because again, when I hear the Afro-pessimists say, look, there's nothing analogous, right, to Black suffering, it creates all kinds of issues around how can I talk to other folk if in light of that, in light of the kind of the social death. And so I'm optimistic in terms of the political strategies and the willingness for people to work on very specific kinds of projects, like what happened with, say, Ossoff, Warnock, and Abrams. And yet I'm not sure about anything beyond that. I think for us to see this kind of transformative moment, we have to have what Lewis Gordon calls Afro-Jews or Black Jews take center stage in this conversation, because they can really link us in very powerful ways that I think we just can't imagine, because they've been so silent for so long.
Well, please join me in thanking all of our panelists for their wonderful